We are live. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Mishnah Mastery. Goodness gracious me, it's been a long time since we've been able to study together, and we have moved on to Masechet Temurah. So that is what we are going to be moving on to now as we get ever closer to the end of Seder Kodshim. We are going to be on Masechet Temurah tonight. So first of all, I think we need to understand a little bit about what Temurah is. So Temurah, the Hebrew word, means to exchange. So what are we exchanging? So what we are taught is as follows, that if a person was to designate a sacrifice, they would not then be able to exchange that sacrifice for another animal. Because once you have consecrated it, once you have invested it with sanctity and with holiness, so it will now not be possible to put the sanctity of the first animal into a second animal. Now, the truth is, it is possible to do this, but you're not allowed to do this. The Torah says you cannot do Temurah. You cannot exchange a sanctified animal for a profane animal. But if you do that, then you end up with two sanctified animals. So we're going to need to understand what would happen with these animals. We're going to need to understand when it applies and when it doesn't apply, when it's valid and when it's not valid, because you're violating a biblical prohibition if you do it. But nonetheless, if you were to try and exchange a holy animal for a profane animal, so you are going to invest that second animal with holiness as well. So with that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, let's turn our attention to chapter 1 of Masechet Temurah. Are we ready, ladies and gentlemen? Then we shall begin. Says the Mishnah as follows in chapter 1, Mishnah 1, Mishnah Aleph. So, Hakol Mamirim. Anybody is capable of effecting Temurah. Their words will be effective if they were to do this. So it has to be an individual. So the Mishnah says, Echad Anashim ve'echad Nashim, whether it's a woman who does it or whether it's a man who does it. Lo sha'adam rashai lahamir, not that a person is permitted biblically to do Temurah, to exchange these animals. Ella, but she'im heimir mumar, if you were to exchange the sanctified animal for a profane animal, mumar, your words are effective, but the sofeg es rabbaim, but you are going to get 40 lashes or 40 minus 1 lashes for having done so, because it is a violation of a biblical prohibition. Now, in order to do it, you have to be the original owner. So says the Mishnah, HaKohanim mamirim es shelahem. Kohanim can effect Temurah, even though they're not allowed to. The Yisrael mamirim es shelahem. And a Yisrael can also do it, even though they're not allowed to. But ein haKohanim mamirim lo b'chatat v'lo b'asham v'lo b'bechor. But a Kohen, according to the first position in the Mishnah, is not able to exchange a korban chatat because they get portions of this from other people. So they are not the original owners. V'lo b'asham, and the same with guilt offerings. I've just realized I'm not showing you the English. Let's scroll down so you can see the English. V'lo b'bechor, and not with a firstborn offering, which also they are receiving and are not the original owners. However, comes along Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Does he? One second. So it comes along Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Rabbi Yochanan says, why is a Kohen not able to exchange, to substitute? There's another word translation for you there, substitution, exchanging, whatever it is. Why can a Kohen not do that for a Bechor? They own the Bechor. So according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, if you are a full owner of the animal, you are an individual. It doesn't matter if you were the original owner or whether you received it from somebody else. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri would say that a Kohen is therefore able to effect Temurah with a bechor, a firstborn animal, because they are a full owner while the animal is still alive, as opposed to chatat and asham, where they are receiving portions after the sacrifice has been done. However, Amalo Rabbi Akiva says, chatas v'asham atanach lakohen, a chatas and an asham are gifts to the kohen, v'habachor matana lakohen, and the bechor is also a gift to the kohen. Ma chatas v'asham ein mamirim bo, just like with the chatas and the asham, a kohen is not able to substitute, is not able to exchange. Af habachor lo yimirenu vo. So too, with the firstborn animal, according to Rabbi Akiva, he is not going to be able to effect Temurah. Amalo Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says in response to this, Mali eino meimir b'chatas v'asham she'ein zachin mahem b'chayehem. No, the difference is with chatas and asham, the kohen is never acquiring any ownership of the animal during its lifetime. Toma b'bechor she'zachin bo b'chayav, but you want to apply that to a bechor where they are taking ownership, they are acquiring ownership during the animal's lifetime. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, a kohen should be able to do Temurah on a firstborn. Not that they're allowed to, biblically or not, but if they did, then according to him, it would be effective. Amalo Rabbi Akiva says back to him, but it says in the pasuk in Vayikra chapter 27, verse 10, V'hayahu utmurato yihye kodesh, that it and the Temurah and the exchanged animal, the substituted animal, should be considered sanctified. Heichan kedusha chala alav. When do we say that the kedusha, the sanctity, falls on this animal? Bebeit haba'alim, as long as it's in the house of the owner. Af Temurah bebeis haba'alim. Therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, even Temurah can only be affected if it is in the house of the original owner. But a bechor has now been gifted to a kohen. Therefore, it's not with the original owner, and so even though it's still alive, according to Rabbi Akiva, it's not going to be able to be affected as Temurah by a kohen. Mishnah base, the Torah tells us that if you exchange a behema for a behema, an animal for an animal, they are both going to become sanctified. But that is only if the new animal is ra'ui la korban, only if it could theoretically be offered up as a sacrifice. Says the Mishnah, Memirin min bakar alatzon. You can substitute cattle over a sheep. Not that you're allowed to, but if you did, it would be effective. Umin atzon ala bakar, and vice versa, sheep on cattle. Mina kvasim ala izim, lambs on goats. Mina izim ala kvasim, and goats on lambs. Mina zacharim ala nakevas, males on females. Mina nakevas ala zacharim, and females on males. Minatamimim. I'm not entirely certain why a person, by the way, would want to exchange these animals, but I guess they have a reason. Maybe they were consecrating an animal for a particular korban. The wife found out and said, "No, not Daisy. That's my favorite cow." And they're like, "Oh, that's okay. Well, let's just exchange it onto another one then." You wouldn't be allowed to, but if you did, then it would be effective. Minatamimim abale mumim. Says the Mishnah, you could exchange blemished animals. Unblemished animals on blemished animals, and blemished animals on unblemished animals. Shneimar, because as it says in the pasuk, lo yachelifenu, you shall not exchange, you shall not substitute. V'lo yamir tov bara or tov, and you should not exchange good on bad, nor bad for good. Asks the Mishnah, Ezehu tov bara. What do we mean when we say you would be exchanging a good one for a bad one? Says the Mishnah, Bale mumim shekadam hekdeshin es mumam. That is where an animal got its was sanctified before it got blemished. The consecration preceded the blemish. That would be an example of where you are getting trying to swap out something bad for an animal that's good. Memirim echad b'shnayim. You could exchange one animal for two animals. Ushnaim be'echad, and two for one. Echad b'meya, one for 100, u'meya be'echad, and 100 for one, according to that position in the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon says, Ein memirin ela echad be'echad. Rabbi Shimon says, no, it has to be one for one. You wouldn't be able to exchange or substitute many for one. Shneimar, as it says in the pasuk in Vayikra chapter 27, V'hayahu utmarato, it says it and its substitute should be sanctified. Mahu miyuchad, av Temurah miyuchadis. Just like it has to be one specific animal, so too its exchanged substitute also has to be one specific animal. Mishnah Gimel. What if you want to do Temurah with parts of an animal? Does that work, or does it have to be a whole animal? Says the Mishnah, Ein mamirin, evarim b'ubarim. You cannot substitute limbs of an animal for consecrated fetuses, v'lo ubarim b'evarim, and you wouldn't be able to exchange fetuses for limbs. V'lo evarim v'ubarim b'shleimim, you wouldn't be able to exchange limbs of fetuses for whole animals, or vice versa. V'lo shleimim b'hem, you would not be able to exchange whole profane animals for them. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yossi says that you would be able to exchange limbs for whole animals and whole animals for limbs, because he would say that as long as the profane animal is complete, you can make Temurah on these parts, because fundamentally, if someone was to sanctify a limb of an animal, they were to point at the leg of a cow and say that that should be sanctified for the Beis Hamikdash, so then Rabbi Yossi would say the Kedusha would spread throughout the whole animal. And if the Kedusha is spreading throughout the whole animal in that instance, it can be effective as well for Temurah, according to Rabbi Yossi. Amar Rabbi Yossi, v'halo b'mukdashin ha'omei ragla shel zo'olah. If you had a leg of an olah, you were to say that that leg should be for the olah, kula olah, it would all become an olah. So too, if you were to say that this leg should substitute for that one, so then the whole thing should be Temurah. Mishnah Daled. So by way of introduction to Mishnah Daled, we first have to address Mishnah Hey. We're going to see something in Mishnah Hey that follows a particular structure of phrasing, and because it mentions that in Mishnah Hey, we first have to go through a couple of different topics in Mishnah Daled, which have the same phraseological structure. Does that make sense? Not at all. Phraseological is not a real word. But basically, we explore three different topics in this Mishnah because of the common usage of wording that applies in each of these cases. So because we employ the same principle in each of these different topics, we first of all have to look at some of these different topics. So the first topic that we look at is called Meduma. And Meduma is a mixture of Terumah and Chulin. And fundamentally, if any Terumah was to fall into Chulin, if let's call them apples, if apples of Terumah set aside for a Kohen falls into a barrel of apples which are not consecrated, not sanctified, not separated for anything else, so then fundamentally we've got a problem, because a non-Kohen is not allowed to eat those apples because it could be an apple of Terumah. That's unless there is 100 times the amount of the Terumah in the Chulin barrel already. So one apple falls into 100 Chulin apples, so then it's going to be nullified. It's going to be considered insignificant and you don't have to worry about it. Any less than that, and you do have to worry about it, and the apples have to be given to a Kohen because you don't know which one is Terumah and which one isn't. Now, let's say you have apples that fall into Chulin, and then those apples fall into another barrel of Chulin. So what happens to the ratio over here? Is it considered, let's say one apple falls into 50 apples, so it's not enough to be nullified, but then those 51 apples fall into another 50 apples. So is that considered 1 in 100 apples, or is that considered 51 potential Terumah apples falling into another 50? So then you still got a problem, right? So that's the question that we're kind of addressing. That's the topic that we're addressing, and the Mishnah tells us that the mixture will render the mixture. In other words, the cumulative effect of a terumah apple falling into 50 apples and then falling into another 50 apples, it will be considered lefi cheshbon, by the total calculation. So it would be considered as if it's fallen into 100 apples, not as if it's fallen into 51 apples falling into another 50 apples. So it depends on the calculation of the cumulative effect. In a similar vein, the next issue is yeast of terumah being mixed into dough of chulin. So it's not so straightforward. It's not the same as a distinguishable apple falling into other distinguishable apples, because the yeast is going to have an impact and cause the dough to rise. So it doesn't have the same kind of ratio to easily calculate it. But the Mishnah tells us, and dough that was leavened with terumah yeast is going to create a problem for more dough if it gets mixed in with other dough according to the calculation. The next topic that it talks about is water which comes from a drawn source, let's say well water, falling into mikveh water, which is natural water. So here we have another ratio. You have to have 40 sa'ah of natural rainwater, call it, natural water, to be able to have a valid mikveh. But what if any tap water goes into that mikveh? So if you've got 3 log of water that falls into the mikveh, if there's 40 sa'ah, it's not going to make a difference. If it didn't have 40 sa'ah, then it is going to be problematic. So the Mishnah says, so drawn water is going to invalidate a mikveh according to the calculation, according to the ratio and the order in which the water is being added or being mixed in or falling into the water of the mikveh. Says the Mishnah in Mishnah Hay, talking about para aduma, the red heifer. So in order to purify an individual who has been contaminated by a corpse, you have to mix ashes of para aduma, the red heifer, with water. So the Mishnah says, Ein mechatas na'asin mechatas ela in matan efer. So purification water of the para aduma is only going to mix in, as it were, with other water of purification, as long as there has been placement of the ashes of the para aduma. The ashes have to go on top of the water. So even though you could pour water on top of ashes, it's really ashes that go on top of water. So it's only going to become water that can be used for purifying somebody contaminated by a corpse if ashes have been put onto the water. Another topic, ein beis hapras ose beis hapras. A beis hapras is a field that has a grave somewhere buried in that field. The trouble is that the field has been plowed at some point, and because the field has been plowed, you don't really know where the bones of this body have ended up, and so it creates a big problem for Kohanim to be able to walk through a beis hapras. So the halacha would be that because you don't know that there's not going to be a bone somewhere in that field that a Kohen could then walk over, so they say that for a radius of 100 amot in one of these fields, that's going to be the area that is problematic for a Kohen. And if anybody touches that area, then they're going to be impure. The question is, though, if it's plowed over once and then plowed over again, do you then extend the radius even further? And the Mishnah says, Ein beis hapras, ose beis hapras. The fact that it has been plowed over once is not going to restart the count of expanding into more radii of 100 amos. If it's 100 amos, that is the radius. It's not going to extend that even further. And then that leads us into velo teruma achad teruma. The teruma is not so if a person was to say that they are separating a 40th or a 50th or a 60th of their crops for terumah, and then goes back and takes more crops to say that this is also going to be terumah, it's not going to combine into one measurement. So ein terumah achar terumah, the quantity of terumah that you're setting aside is not going to be compounded with terumah that you've previously allocated. And now we get to the topics that are relevant to Temurah. V'lo Temurah, osa Temurah. If you were to substitute an animal and that animal now has sanctity, you can't then go and substitute that animal for another animal. It doesn't compound in that way. V'lo Temurah, osa Temurah. So you can't substitute an animal that has already been substituted. It's not going to give it any sanctity. V'lo havlad osa Temurah. An offspring of a sanctified animal is not going to render a non-sacred animal as its substitute. If you were to try and substitute that, because it wasn't sanctified for a korban, it's just holy because it came out of a korban. So that is also not going to be able to be substituted. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he says differently. Havlad osa Temurah. Offspring is going to be able to be substituted in some way. Amru lo, say the Chachamim to Rabbi Yehuda, Hekdesh osa Temurah. Sanctified animals are going to be able to be substituted. Lo havlad, but not offspring. V'lo Temurah osin Temurah, and they anyway agreed that Temurah cannot substitute for Temurah, but the Chachamim say a vlad, an offspring of an animal, is not able to be affected as Temurah. Mishnah Vav. Temurah only applies to animals, says the Mishnah. Ha'ofos v'hamanachos, birds and flower offerings, einan osin Temurah, cannot be exchanged, cannot be substituted. Shelo ne'emar ela behema, because the Torah only intended for this halacha to apply to animals. Hatzibur v'hashutafim einan osin Temurah. The public, even though they're comprised of individuals, and partners of an animal, even though they are individuals in their own right, einan osin Temurah, they cannot effect Temurah. Shne'emar lo yamir oto, he shall not exchange. Yachid osa Temurah, so the Mishnah learns an individual can effect Temurah, lo hatzibur v'lo hashutafim osin Temurah, but the public and partners cannot effect Temurah. Korbanot bedech habayis einam osin Temurah. The sacrifices that or things which have been sanctified for temple maintenance cannot effect Temurah. Rabbi Shimon, Omer Rabbi Shimon, va'lo hamase bichlal haya. So Rabbi Shimon says, in a very unique application of one of the 13 principles that we talk about every day in Rabbi Yishmael. So in a rare application of Kol Davar Shahaya Bichlal Yatsa Min HaKlal, right? Lo lelamed ala tzmo yatsa, ela lelamed ala klal kolo yatsa. So if we're familiar with that particular hermeneutic principle that we say every morning, I think it's a hermeneutic principle, isn't it? Isn't that the fancy word that no one knows what it means, but that's what we call it. So one of them is that one of them is applied in this instance by Rabbi Shimon as follows. So he says, "V'halo mas ha'ma'aser bichlal haya." Ma'aser, the concept of ma'aser behema, the 10th of each of your animals, the 10th animal of every 10th animal would be designated for ma'aser behema. So that is used as the generic starting point for talking about Temurah. So that was brought for the klal, for the general principle of Temurah. V'lama yatsa, and why is it then singled out? Where in the flow of the verses in relation to Temurah, it gets singled out. So lama yatsa lahakish elav, in order to compare and to contrast, in order to teach us something. Ma Maaseh Korban Yachid, just like Maaseh is an individual offering, Yatsu Korbanot Sibur, so it's going to exclude communal offerings. So even though it's brought very generally, it was also singled out. And the reason why it was singled out is to teach us a lesson for Temurah. What's the lesson? Just like Maaseh is an individual sacrifice and it excludes public communal sacrifices, so too Temurah is only going to apply to an individual's animal. Ma Maaseh Korban Mizbeach, just like Maaseh is an animal which is brought to the Mizbeach, Yatsu Korbanot Bedek Habayis, that's going to exclude Korbanot of the Bedek Habayis, items which have been consecrated for temple maintenance, they are going to be also excluded from the concept, from the halacha of Temurah. And with that, we say, ladies and gentlemen, Mazel Tov on completing chapter 1 of Maseches Temurah. We dive in to chapter 2, to Perek Beis, where we're discussing various differences between public sacrifices and private sacrifices. So there's going to be three unique halachot, three stringencies perhaps, that apply to one over the other. Yesh b'korbanot hayachid, ma she'ein b'korbanot hatzibur. There are halachas that apply to a private sacrifice that don't apply to a public sacrifice. V'yesh b'korbanot hatzibur, ma she'ein b'korbanot hayachid. And there are halachas that apply to a public sacrifice that don't apply to a private sacrifice. And the three that apply to a public sacrifice that don't apply to a private sacrifice are vice versa. For an individual, for a private sacrifice, Temurah will apply. That's number one. Number two, it could be male or female. And number three, a private sacrifice, if it wasn't brought at the right time, still has to be brought. So says the Mishnah. Shekorbanos hayachid osim Temurah. Individual sacrifices effect Temurah. The korbanot hatzibur einam osim Temurah. Public sacrifices do not. Korbanot hayachid nohagin bazcharim uvanakevot. Private sacrifices can either come from male animals or female animals. The korbanot tzibur einam nohagin elam zacharim. But public sacrifices only ever come from male animals. Korbanos hayachid chayavin ba'acharayusan. Private animals, if something was to happen to them, they would still have to be not substituted, let's not use that word, they would still have to be compensated and brought with a different animal if something happened to the first one. And for their accompanying libations, they would also have to be brought at a later time if they were not brought at the right time. The korbanot hasibur ein chayavin lo ba'acharayusan v'lo ba'acharayus niskehen. For public sacrifices, if something happened which would mean that you can't bring it, you wouldn't have to replace it, you wouldn't have to compensate for a public sacrifice. Aval, however, there is an exception to this rule. Chayavin ba'acharayus niskehen mishikarav hazavach. If you had already brought the sacrifice and hadn't yet brought the accompanying libations at the right time, you still would have to bring them even at a different time. Two stringencies that apply to public sacrifices that don't apply to private sacrifices. Yesh b'korbanot hatzibur ma she'ein b'korbanot hayachid. Two things that apply to a public sacrifice that don't apply to a private sacrifice. She'korbanos hatzibur doichines haShabbos v'haSutumah. Public sacrifices are going to be brought on Shabbos, so it doesn't get impacted by Shabbos. If everything in the Beis Hamikdash was tamei, or most of the people, most of the nation were impure, or the kohanim were tamei, or the vessels were tamei, everything was impure in the Beis Hamikdash, you would still be able to override that problem and bring the public sacrifice. That's not the case for private sacrifices. For korbanot hayachid einam doichin lo es Shabbos v'lo es hatzuma. They would not be overridden by Shabbos, and they would not override Shabbos, and they would not be allowed to be brought if you or the animal or the utensils or whatever were impure. Amar Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says there's an exception to this. You've got two exceptions. The chavitim of the Kohen Gadol, the pan offering that the Kohen Gadol would bring every day with his Korban Mincha, and the par of Yom Kippur, the bull offerings of Yom Kippur, which are both considered individual offerings, and yet, says the Mishnah, as a Shabbos Vesatuma, they too would override Shabbos, and they would also override Tumah. So that's the question that Rabbi Meir asks. Don't these things prove to be an exception to the rule? They're individual offerings, and they do override Shabbos and Tumah. Ella, rather we have to say Shezmanon Kavua. It's a public sacrifice with no set time, which would it would be a private offering with a fixed time that would also override. So we say that public sacrifices, yes, would override Shabbos. Private sacrifices would not, unless they had a fixed time, like the daily offering of the Kohen Gadol, like the par of Yom Kippur. Those things have fixed times, and they would override. Mishnah base. In Masechet Zvachim, we learned about 5 types of Korban Chatat that, because they would not be allowed to be brought in the Beis HaMikdash, you would leave them in a room or in an area to starve to death. So 3 of them apply to private sacrifices, 2 of them apply to public ones. So first type is a child of a Korban Chatat. That would need to be left to die. The Temurah, the substitute of a Korban Chatat, and also a Korban Chatat where the owner died before bringing it. In all those instances, they would have to be left to die. Number 4, a Chatat that got lost and was found after a replacement was brought, that would have to be left to die. And number 5, if the animal was over a year old by the time you eventually got round to bringing it. So 4th and 5th ones apply to public and private, but the other ones only apply to a private sacrifice. Says the Mishnah, Chatas hayachid shekipru ba'alav. The chatat, the sin offering of an individual, shekipru ba'alav, that where the owner had already achieved atonement, right? So that's the example that we mentioned, where you lost the first one, brought a second one, and then found the first one. That one, meitot, has to be left to die. Mishel tzibur, but if it was a public sacrifice, then einan meitot, then it would not be left to die. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, even a public one would be left to die. Amar Rabbi Shimon says, Ma matzinu bevlad chatat uvitmurat chatat, that just as we found with regards to a chatat, a sin offering, uvitmurat chatat, and the substitute of a sin offering, uvachatat shemetu ba'aleha, and a sin offering where the owners have died, bayachid devarim amurim, we apply and say that these animals have to die if they are individuals, aval lo batzibur, but not if they belong to the public. Af shekipru haba'alim, even a sacrifice, a chatat, which the owner had already been given atonement for because they brought a second one and then they found the first one. The she'avra shenasan, or it got too old, it had gone past a year. By yachid devarim amurim, so with a private sacrifice, then it has to be left to die. Avalo but sibur, but not with a public sacrifice. Mishnah Gimel, talking now about Kodshin and Temurah, and stringencies that apply one way or the other. Says the Mishnah, there are ways in which Kodshim are treated more stringently than the substitutes, and ways in which the substitutes are treated more strictly than the Kodshim. Says the Mishnah, Kodshim osim Temurah, consecrated animals can effect Temurah. Ve'ein Temurah osa Temurah. And as we said earlier, Temurah cannot effect Temurah. Hatzibur v'hashutafim makdishim. The public and partners are able to consecrate animals together. Avolom and Miriam, but as we said earlier, they cannot do Temurah. Umakdishin Evarim Ubarim, you can consecrate limbs and fetuses, Avolom and Miriam, but you can't exchange them. Chomer betruma, the stringencies of truma would be shahakdusha chala al balas mum kavua, that the sanctity will fall on a animal which is blemished. So what's this referring to? If a person consecrated an animal with a permanent blemish, since it was never fit to be brought on the Mizbeach, if it got redeemed, right, then its kedusha would be removed and it would be completely permitted for use. But if you do Temurah, if you substitute on a blemished animal, you can't bring it as a korban, but if it gets redeemed, you'd be allowed to slaughter and eat it, but you can't milk it, and you can't do any work with it, and you can't shear the wool either. So the Mishnah says the stringency of Temurah is the kedusha will fall on a balmum, on a blemished animal, but were you to redeem it, it wouldn't be allowed for shearing and for working with, or for milking as well. Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yossi says another chumrah, another stringency, asa shogig kamezid but truma. If you intended to consecrate an animal, but by mistake you designated it, I think, for the wrong thing, so then there is a leniency for a sacrifice that doesn't apply to Temurah. If you were to mistakenly designate something as Temurah, it's going to take effect. So Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda says, Asa shogig kamezid but truma. It doesn't matter whether you mistakenly designated it, it's still going to be treated as if you intentionally designated it for truma. V'lo asa shogig kamezid b'mikdashim, but that doesn't apply to sacrifices. Rabbi Elazar says, Hakilayim, if you've got animals which are born of a forbidden mixture, Vahatrefa, animals which are treif, they've got a fatal wound, the Yotze Dofen, and animals which have been born by caesarean section, Tumtum, animals which have neither sign of gender, androgynous, and animals which have both signs of gender, lo kadeshin v'lo makdishin. These cannot be sanctified, and they cannot sanctify through Temurah either. So they cannot be consecrated and they cannot sanctify by being Temurah either. Mazel tov, ladies and gentlemen, on completing chapter 2 of Maseches Temurah. And that's all for this week. Please God, next week, if we're able to, we will continue with chapters 3 and chapters 4. Maybe chapter 5 if I'm good enough. Let's see how we go. Take it easy, guys. Mazel tov, 2 prakim. We're back in the game. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.